On today's edition of Conspiracy Theory, I want to play a game called Where's It Gonna Turn? One of the things I like to do, so these solid lines are the ones that I would draw normally, and my auto trend lines draw them for me. They are the latest top trend lines, so the ones that haven't been broken yet. Anything that's a dash line has been broken, and I draw those in myself. And it's really more for me to see where, more precisely where price is and why it is where it is. So for example, this one would have been drawn off of these first 2 points, and you can see price dips below it but continues to respect it all the way up to here, and this is probably where, like with this amount of like downforce on this breaking through it, it never quite reaches back up above. And this is really telling, because if it breaks through a trend line and can't retake that trend line, especially if it starts deviating from the trend line further, like here it actually touches, here it doesn't, there's a good chance that it's probably not going to make it further. So once it starts turning away from the trend line, I mean it can definitely turn around, but the chances are a lot lower once it starts deviating further and further. And then once it does, you can start drawing upper trend lines up against it to see where that's going to go as well, and when it starts turning against that. So for example, actually some of the first trend lines that would have been here would have been up here. Let's say this one, or this one looks a little bit higher. So we put one here, and you can see that once price action, it sort of avoids it to about this point, starts touching it, and that's a more bullish sign here, and then creates this new trend line here and doesn't reach it again. So that's, you know, at this point, once it breaks through here, like you've got an upper trend line that it's breaking and a lower trend line that it's respecting, that's bullish. So it gets up to this point, creates a new trend line here off of the peaks. And this is all on a 1 minute. I do all of my charting like this on a 1 minute because it's incredibly accurate. So we've now drawn this line from here, and price action sort of toys with it a little bit, breaks through, starts creating, like it creates this trend line and then breaks through again here, and then respects it barely, but manages to make it through after bouncing off of this old trend line. And then this one is created. So you can kind of see how price then, like as soon as a trend line is created, price respects it immediately, creates a new one here, and then has trouble getting over it, but then does, and then creates a new one here. So this solid line means it hasn't been broken yet. But what's interesting about this one is, so this trend line that was created here continues up and becomes the peak for this one. And this is, once you see something like this where it almost reaches the trend line and can't, you know at that point that this is probably where it's going to pivot, because there's not enough strength for it to even reach the trend line, and it's been a while, and this is an old trend line, you know, and you can kind of see, if you look across, there's some horizontal congestion here as well, which is just more confluence. I mean, you've got some solid lines that it's just not breaking through. So at this point, you have a much higher certainty of an entry that's like a put that's going to be successful. And in fact, it does drop pretty quick. So this trend line was created here, and you can see it drops through it, and then this down here at the time would have been the solid trend line. Doesn't quite reach it and tries to get back up again, but then hits this trend line again. This is the one that was formed here. So price respected it here, broke through, came back down, broke down underneath it, and that's why it probably fell, because like there's wicks above, but the bodies are all below, and it drops down to here. So it recovers. When it gets back here, it can barely wick above. And this is why I play, you know, these trend line rejections, because they're easy. I mean, like, you know where your risk is. It's above the trend line. If it gets too far up above the trend line, especially if it reaches the next trend line, then you're screwed. So you've got to get out. You know, you've got a pretty well-defined risk here on this line. But then once it starts going down, it can drop pretty quickly. So it drops, and you can see the next congestion area is what would have been the solid line at this point. It breaks through, tries to take it back, but can't. And so now you know you've got all those bulls on the run, and it just starts dropping. And once it drops through this level, And you can see how price starts trying to respect it, but then it falls through, and that's incredibly bearish here. So it keeps dropping until it hits this one, and this is the one it turns at. So regardless of the price levels, I mean, you can look at the price levels for additional confluence for sure. This isn't the only reason the price action is moving this way, but this is an incredibly good indicator for where these pivot points actually are. They happen on these old trend lines almost all the time. And so once you draw these in, you can leave them in for a while just to see how price is doing very specifically against these lines. And you can see, so this line was created way back here, like more than an hour before, and yet here price is again trying to respect it. So you could have had another put entry here because this is actually not breaking through that line. But once it does break through that line, it breaks through with some force and keeps going up. So if this line makes it up to here, there's a good chance that you could try puts again, but it would just depend on how, like at this point, it's bounced off of one of these trend lines and has reversed. This is the pivot, and it's come back down and formed this bounce. And so this is another, I mean, none of these are actual like candlestick patterns that I've seen people teach, but it gets more at the underlying structure of why there are candlestick patterns and what they're doing. And how you can get in earlier, just based on looking at how price is interacting with these historical trend lines. You can make fairly accurate and precise assessments of where price is going to turn and why. And when it does break through one of these, you could ride the breakout. I'm not much of a breakout trader, but you could definitely do it. I like to be in earlier as pivoted as possible. So I'll get on these pivots and try those instead. But this just gives you a whole lot more range than just price level alone, because with just price level you could say, well, this is probably a pretty good level, and then price does jump up above that level. It's also a psych level. 4100 is a pretty solid one, so you know that just from the psych level that this is going to be a struggle in the first place, because it does test it here and reject, and then it breaks through. But this time when it breaks through that price level, it's also contending with this diagonal. So when it does break through all of that, then it's a fairly large pop, because whatever people are looking at, and for whatever reason they're trading where they are, and I'm not suggesting that anyone else in the world is trading off of these lines. I mean, it's certainly possible, but that's not the reason the price is turning. The price is turning there, and this becomes a gauge of the overall trend support. Just because this is how price action works. When you're trying to buy low and sell high, it follows trends, and this is one of the trends it's following, and this is where it bounces. And you see this all the time. When you create a trend line, you'll see it respected over and over again. So I would expect price to get back up to this line at least, and if it doesn't, it's going to turn somewhere in here. This is where I would start getting into this, up in here. So this is, maybe it turned a little quick. So I don't actually have any hope for this as a bullish move overall. I think that it had a great pop, but this turn makes me question its strength. This could just be a dip, and it's possible there's some structure in here that I didn't draw in. And that if I do draw it in, that you'll see that it bounced off of another line. So let's try duplicating this one and just adding in a little more detail on the one. And sure enough, that's where that is. So you can see that drawing off of these peaks is important. I mean, it's not just because it lets you see that this is where the break was, and this is it retests it and pops back up. So this level here ends up becoming a level. So this is 4106.50. Why that level? Well, it's because that's where the trends were. I mean, it's not random. There's definitely direction to it. So when it bounces off of this one, this is where you could buy the dip, because you see that it broke through this trend line, and then retested it, and then started back up again. So at this point, you could get in pretty low. You have a pretty good idea of where the dip is, and then follow it up to here, and you can either use this as a scale point, or you can just sort of watch price action in this area, and if it doesn't manage to break through it, see how far back down it comes. If it doesn't come all the way back down to this line, then it's probably going to keep going. Like this one didn't come all the way back down to this line, so it's probably going to keep going. So that's how these historical trend lines can be incredibly powerful for figuring out where the pivots are, where price is going to turn.